The disappearance of handyman Frank Cole was written off as a hiking accident near a controversial new development. His brother, a local journalist, suspected foul play but had no proof. The narrative shattered when a biologist studying local wildlife captured a photo of a coyote. The animal was carrying Frank's tattered work glove, but more unsettling was where it was found, at the mouth of an undocumented drainage pipe, leaking a strange chemical substance into the woods. That single image did more to reopen a year-old wound than any condolence card or police report ever could. What do you think is the one clue that could never be explained away in a loved one's disappearance? Let's explore how a single, impossible photograph unraveled a lie that was buried a year deep. For a full year, Simon Cole's life had been lived in a fog. As a journalist for the small-town paper, the Oak Valley Chronicle, his days were supposed to be filled with deadlines and local stories. Instead, they were marked by a hollow space at his side, a silence on the other end of the phone where his older brother Frank used to be. Every morning, Simon would sit at his desk, staring at the cheerful headline of the day, "Annual Bake Sale a Sweet Success," while the unpublished headline in his mind screamed, "Local man vanishes, police do nothing." The official story was neat, tidy, and completely wrong. Frank, a handyman and part-time environmental surveyor, had taken a job on a property bordering the new Blackwood Pines luxury housing development. His truck was found parked at the job site, keys in the ignition, a half-eaten sandwich on the passenger seat. The police, led by a sheriff nearing retirement, concluded that Frank, an avid outdoorsman, had decided to go for a quick hike on the adjacent state forest trails and had a tragic accident. A week-long search turned up nothing. Case closed. Accidental death. Body likely lost to the elements. But Simon knew his brother. Frank was meticulous. He didn't take unplanned hikes without proper gear, and he never, ever left a job unfinished. Most damning of all was their final phone call, the day before he disappeared. Frank's voice had been tight with a strange energy, a mix of excitement and anger. "You won't believe what I found out here, Si," he'd said. "There's something wrong. Something really wrong with this whole Blackwood operation." Before he could explain, he'd promised to call back the next day with the full story. That call never came. Simon had pushed the police, presenting them with Frank's cryptic last words, but they dismissed it. "People say things," the sheriff had sighed, patting his shoulder with false sympathy. He was probably just upset about the construction noise. The helplessness was the worst part. Simon was a journalist, a man whose entire career was built on finding and exposing the truth, yet he couldn't find the truth about his own brother. His grief became a quiet obsession, turning him from a promising reporter into a man just going through the motions, his career and his spirit slowly eroding under the weight of the unknown. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after Frank vanished, an email landed in his inbox. The subject line was simple: image regarding the Blackwood Pines Wildlife Corridor. The sender was a Dr. Eris Thorne, a biology professor at the State University. Simon almost deleted it, assuming it was another press release about the developer's supposed commitment to the environment. But something made him click it open. The email was brief. Dr. Thorne explained that he was monitoring the displacement of local wildlife due to the development. He had set up several trail cameras in the surrounding forest. He thought a particular image might be of interest, given the unsolved disappearance in that area last year. Simon's heart began to beat a little faster. He scrolled down and opened the attached JPEG file. The image was grainy, stamped with a date and time in the corner. It showed a patch of muddy ground, a cluster of ferns, and in the center of the frame, a coyote. It was a healthy-looking animal, its fur thick and its eyes bright. But it was what the coyote held in its mouth that made the air leave Simon's lungs. A work glove, a tattered, well-worn leather glove, dark with oil stains and instantly recognizable. On the cuff, Simon could just make out the faded, stitched initials his mother had sewn into all their work clothes years ago: FC, Frank Cole. It was Frank's glove, there was no doubt, but the shock of seeing it was quickly eclipsed by the background of the photo. The coyote wasn't on a hiking trail. It was standing at the mouth of a wide, concrete drainage pipe, half hidden by weeds and brush. From the pipe, a trickle of dark, Oily liquid oozed into the mud, staining it a sickly, iridescent color. Simon stared at the screen, his mind racing. The hiking accident theory had just been blown to pieces. That pipe wasn't on any park map, and Frank, who knew the local woods better than anyone, would never have been wandering in a swampy, industrial runoff area. The photo wasn't just a clue, it was a signpost pointing directly away from the official story and toward the one place Simon had suspected all along, the Blackwood Pines development. The fog in his mind began to clear, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He finally had a lead. He finally had a place to start digging. Simon replied to Dr. Thorne's email immediately, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He thanked him for the image and asked if they could meet. The biologist responded within the hour, agreeing to meet him at a coffee shop near the university the next morning. For the first time in a year, Simon felt a surge of purpose, the old journalistic instincts kicking back in. He spent the rest of the night poring over every article, every public filing, every zoning permit related to Blackwood Pines and its parent company, Sterling Corp. He was no longer just a grieving brother. He was a reporter with a story to break. The next morning, Simon met Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a man in his late 50s with a wiry frame and a passion for his work that was immediately apparent. "I almost didn't send it," Eris admitted after they'd ordered coffee. "I thought it might be too painful, reopening an old wound. But the location, it bothered me." He pulled out a topographical map and spread it across the table, pointing to a spot marked with a red circle. "My camera was here," he said, tapping the circle. "It's about 2 miles deep into the woods on the northern edge of the Sterling property. It's nowhere near the public access trails. The only reason to be out there is if you're tracking something or if you're trying to hide something." He described the substance leaking from the pipe, how it had created a small dead zone around it where the vegetation was withered and gray. "Have you reported this to the Environmental Protection Agency?" Simon asked. Eris gave a weary smile. "I've reported Sterling Corp 6 times for various violations. They have deep pockets and better lawyers. The EPA sends an inspector. Sterling pays a small fine for a clerical error, and nothing changes. This pipe, though, this is different. It's not documented on any of their plans. It's not supposed to exist." Simon knew he had to see it for himself. Eris gave him the precise GPS coordinates along with a warning. "Be careful, Simon. That area is technically private property. Sterling has security patrols." That afternoon, Simon drove out to the edge of the state forest, parking his car in a public lot and hiking in, circling around to approach the coordinates from the forest side. The deeper he went, the more the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. After an hour of navigating through the thick underbrush, he smelled it, a sharp, acrid odor like a mix of paint thinner and rotten eggs. He found the pipe exactly where Eris said it would be. It was a grim sight. The dark liquid pulsed out in a slow, steady rhythm, coating the ground in a foul-smelling sheen. Simon put on a pair of rubber gloves he'd brought and used a couple of glass jars to collect samples of the liquid and the surrounding soil. As he worked, he scanned the area. This was no place for a hiker. It was a boggy mess, the ground soft and treacherous. Then he saw it. A few feet from the pipe, a thick branch on a sycamore tree was snapped clean off. The break splintered and fresh-looking, as if something heavy had been slammed against it. On the ground beneath, he found scuff marks in the mud, partially obscured by a year's worth of fallen leaves. They were deep, chaotic impressions, not the neat tread of hiking boots, but the messy, frantic marks of a struggle. His blood ran cold. Frank had been here, and he hadn't been alone. Back in his car, Simon carefully labeled the jars. He had a friend, a grad student named Ben, who worked in the university's chemistry lab. He knew Ben would run an analysis for him. Off the books. As he drove toward the university, his mind was spinning. The illegal pipe, the snapped branch, the scuff marks, it all pointed to a violent confrontation. Frank's last words echoed in his head. Something wrong with this whole Blackwood operation. He hadn't just stumbled upon something. He had been documenting it. His next step was to go after the company itself. He drove to the sleek, modern sales office of Blackwood Pines. Posing as a potential buyer, he got a full tour of the development, listening to the slick salesman talk about sustainability, and living in harmony with nature. The hypocrisy was nauseating. At the end of the tour, he dropped the act. "I'm Simon Cole, a reporter with the Chronicle," he said, pulling out his press pass. "I'm doing a follow-up story on my brother's disappearance last year. I was wondering if I could get a comment from your CEO, Warren Sterling." The salesman's smile froze on his face. The friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, professional mask. "Mr. Sterling doesn't handle press inquiries directly," he said stiffly. "You'll have to go through our corporate PR department." He handed Simon a card and promptly showed him the door. The stonewalling was exactly what he'd expected. That evening, Simon sent a formal request to the PR department, knowing it would likely be ignored. While he waited for the lab results, he started digging into Warren Sterling's past. The man was a ghost online, with a carefully curated digital footprint. But Simon, using his paper's access to professional databases, found a trail of lawsuits in other states. Allegations of unsafe working conditions, environmental violations, and union busting. In every case, Sterling had settled out of court, silencing the plaintiffs with non-disclosure agreements. He was a man who made problems disappear. 2 days later, Ben called from the lab. His voice was low and urgent. "You need to see this," he said, "and we can't talk about it over the phone." Simon met him in a secluded corner of the campus library. Ben slid a printed report across the table. "This is bad, Simon. Really bad," he whispered. "That stuff you brought me is a toxic soup. We found traces of trichloroethylene, benzene, and a bunch of other industrial solvents. This isn't construction runoff. This is industrial waste, and it's highly carcinogenic. The kind of stuff that costs a fortune to dispose of legally." Simon read the list of chemicals, his stomach tightening into a knot. "What kind of industry uses this?" "All sorts," Ben said. "But the specific combination? It's often associated with manufacturing electronics, degreasing heavy machinery, things that have absolutely nothing to do with building luxury homes." The twist was sharper and more terrifying than Simon had imagined. Sterling wasn't just cutting corners on construction. He was using the massive, undeveloped Blackwood Pines property as a personal toxic waste dump. Frank, with his surveyor's eye and his environmental knowledge, wouldn't have just seen a leaky pipe. He would have recognized the dead vegetation, understood the significance of the smell, and known exactly what he was looking at. He wasn't just a witness to a crime, he was an expert witness. And that had made him a threat that Warren Sterling couldn't afford. The official story of a hiking accident wasn't just a lie, it was a cover for murder. Simon now had the what. He had proof of a massive environmental crime, but he still didn't have the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable link between the toxic dump and his brother's death. He knew Sterling Corp would deny everything. They would claim the waste was from a previous owner or that Frank had never been near the pipe. Simon needed something more than soil samples and a grainy photo of a coyote. He needed a witness, or, even better, Frank's own evidence. He remembered Frank was almost never without his rugged, waterproof digital camera, especially on survey jobs. If he had been documenting the illegal dumping, that camera would be a smoking gun. But where was it? Where was Frank? His thoughts kept returning to Frank's last job. He had been hired to survey the property next to the Blackwood development, not the development itself. Simon pulled up the county property records. The land belonged to a Percival Abernathy, a name that rang a faint bell. A quick search in the newspaper's archives brought up a handful of articles from a few years back. Abernathy was a notorious recluse who had owned his 100-acre plot for over 50 years. He had famously refused to sell his land to Sterling Corp., holding out against their offers and threats, becoming a local legend and a major thorn in the developer's side. A new theory began to form in Simon's mind. Frank hadn't been trespassing on Sterling's land. He had been on Abernathy's property, a perfect vantage point to see and to photograph whatever was happening on the other side of the fence line. Abernathy's property was the key. Getting to Abernathy wouldn't be easy. The old man was known to greet uninvited guests with a shotgun. But Simon had to try. He drove out to the address listed in the tax records, a long, unpaved road that ended at a rusty gate adorned with multiple no trespassing signs. He parked his car and approached the gate on foot. "That's far enough," a gruff voice boomed from an intercom speaker mounted on the gatepost. "Mr. Abernathy," Simon called out, holding his hands up where they could be seen. "My name is Simon Cole. I'm a journalist. I need to talk to you about my brother, Frank Cole. He was doing some survey work for you last year, right before he disappeared." There was a long silence, filled only with the sound of the wind in the trees. Simon was about to give up when a loud buzz sounded and the gate clicked open. "You've got 5 minutes," the voice crackled. Simon walked up the long driveway to a small, weathered farmhouse. Percival Abernathy stood on the porch. He was a tall, skeletal man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to look right through him. He held an old hunting rifle loosely in one hand. "I don't talk to reporters," Abernathy said, his voice like gravel. "This isn't about a story for the paper," Simon said, deciding the direct approach was best. "This is about Frank." He took out his phone and showed the old man the picture of the coyote. "The police found my brother's glove. It was down by that northern fence line of yours, near a concrete pipe." Abernathy's hard expression faltered. A flicker of something, fear, regret, passed through his eyes. He lowered the rifle. "Get inside," he muttered, turning and walking into the house. The inside of the farmhouse was cluttered but clean. Abernathy gestured to a worn armchair before sinking into another one opposite Simon. For a long moment, he just stared into the cold fireplace. "I saw him that day," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Your brother, he was a good man. Honest." "What did you see, Mr. Abernathy?" Simon pressed gently. The old man took a deep, shuddering breath. "I saw him arguing with 2 men from Sterling. They were big fellas, security types. They were standing right by that pipe you mentioned. Your brother had his camera out. He was pointing at the pipe, then at their truck. They were yelling. I was watching from the tree line with my binoculars." Abernathy's eyes filled with tears. They grabbed him. He fought back. But there were 2 of them. They hit him. They hit him hard. He went down. The old man's voice broke. They dragged him over the fence, onto my property. I hid. I'm an old man. What could I do? I was scared, son. I've been scared ever since. Where did they take him? Simon asked, his own voice thick with emotion. Abernathy didn't answer. He stood up and walked to the back door, looking out toward a field behind the house. They knew about my old well, he said, the one that went dry 30 years ago. It's deep. They put him in there, and his camera. He pointed with a trembling finger toward a large, flat concrete slab half overgrown with weeds 100 yards away. They covered it with that, said if I ever spoke a word, they'd put me in there with him. Simon felt a wave of nausea and fury. He had his witness. He had the location. He stood up and put a hand on the old man's shoulder. You don't have to be scared anymore, he said. He walked out of the house, pulled out his phone, and dialed 911. He asked for the new sheriff by name, a younger, more competent man who had replaced the one who dismissed him a year ago. Sheriff, it's Simon Cole, he said, his voice steady and clear. I know what happened to my brother, and I know where he is. Within an hour, the Abernathy farm was swarming with police cars. Simon presented the new sheriff with everything he had, the lab report on the toxic waste, Dr. Thorne's photograph, and now the eyewitness testimony of Percival Abernathy. There was no hesitation. The sheriff got a warrant signed by an emergency judge, and a heavy-duty crane was brought in to lift the concrete slab off the old well. As the slab was hoisted into the air, a dark, musty smell rose from the opening. The crime scene unit set up lights, and an officer was lowered into the darkness on a harness. The silence was heavy as everyone waited. A few minutes later, the officer's voice came crackling over the radio. We found him, he said, and I see a camera. Frank's remains, along with his miraculously preserved camera, were carefully brought to the surface. The camera's memory card was intact. At the station, the technicians managed to recover the files. The last photos Frank ever took were chillingly clear. A Sterling Corp truck, its license plate visible, with 2 men in company uniforms dumping barrels of waste into a large, excavated pit that fed directly into the hidden drainage pipe. The final shot was blurry, taken in the middle of a struggle, but it clearly showed the face of one of the men lunging toward the lens. Armed with photographic evidence and Abernathy's testimony, the police moved swiftly. Warren Sterling and his 2 foremen were arrested before the sun set. Faced with the undeniable proof, one of the foremen confessed to everything. Frank had confronted them, threatening to expose their illegal dumping operation. Sterling, reached by phone, had given a single, cold order: handle it. They had killed Frank to silence him, hiding his body on the old man's property, believing his fear would keep him quiet forever. They'd tossed the glove randomly into the woods, a feeble attempt to support the lost hiker narrative. They never imagined a coyote would pick it up and deliver it to a biologist's camera, setting in motion the very exposure they had killed to prevent. The story was front-page news across the state. The Oak Valley Chronicle ran Simon's story under the headline he had been waiting a year to write: "Local Hero Frank Cole Murdered to Cover Up Sterling Corp's Toxic Secret." The investigation exposed a massive environmental catastrophe, and the Blackwood Pines development was shut down permanently, the land designated as a hazardous waste site requiring decades of cleanup. A few weeks later, Simon gave his brother a proper funeral. The entire town came to pay their respects, not to a man who died in a tragic accident, but to a man who had given his life to protect their community. In the aftermath, Simon didn't feel triumph, only a profound sense of peace. Justice had been served. He had found the truth, and in doing so, he had found his own way out of the fog. He eventually left the Chronicle and used the money from a whistleblower fund to start an independent investigative news site dedicated to environmental crimes, naming it the Cole Report in honor of Frank. His work was no longer just a job. It was a mission to ensure that no one else's voice would be silenced the way his brother's had been. When you look at a big corporation, do you think their public promises of protecting the environment are genuine? Or is it just a story they tell while hiding their own versions of a secret drainage pipe? Your thoughts on this are welcome. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it so that others can hear Frank's story. Thank you for listening.